So I actually thought Margie was going to go into the time when I did Margie's training.
And didn't come back.
And didn't come back for the second day.
Just because I was so entertaining.
Oh, you were absolutely informative and entertaining. I just thought I knew it all. So, last session of the day. Best session to present on. I'm sure you're all envious that Chris and I are presenting on this particular session. I don't know about you, but I'm feeling not a lot of energy in the room, so I'm going to get you all to stand. And whilst you are standing, just a little bit of a boogie. Just a little one, not too much. Oh, go crazy if you need to. Really get into it if you need to. Do this, do these. Alright, we're not going to knock you back. Alright, sit down. So although I'm a Generation X person, I like instant gratification. So I will be asking you, if you find this a little boring, if you can't hear me, if you're starting to drift off, stick your hand up. That is instant feedback to me to spice it up or get you to dance again, one of the two, maybe both. So I'm going to talk a little bit about community outrage. I'm going to talk about society, social norms, social trends, and the things that I have been musing about for the last couple of years as I head towards a PhD thesis on, funnily enough, community outrage. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the changing nature of society, the death of community trust, one of the things I like to talk about, and 5 key trends that come out of that are relevant for our industry. So I started with this particular one because I really liked that meme, because it reflects so many things that I see these days. People are just fucking angry. And this one was so angry they made a sign. And it reflects where we're at in society. Our society has changed substantially. And when I say changed substantially, I'm talking between now and 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And this is not just based on gut feel, my friends. I know that we use a lot of gut feel. It's based partially on gut feel, but it's also based on data. It's based on census data, it's based on social license to operate research, and other stats and data that I won't bore you with because data is not something that necessarily interests us. We just like to use it to prove our point. So, I think the biggest thing is, sorry, just catching up, democracy has changed, and I won't bore you with the theory of democracy, but I will just say it has its origins in the Greek language, with demos meaning the whole citizen, or the entire citizen, living in a particular city or state, and with kratos meaning power or rule. Now what's interesting about the definition, and you can look it up, you can Google it, there's multiple different people who give you a definition, but they all have a few key things. The first one, democracy is a belief in the individual who is both moral and rational. Yes. Democracy is a belief in reason, progress, and growth. Democracy is a belief in a society that is consensual, cooperative, and ordered. And a belief in a shared power. So given that is the definition of democracy, we could go off on a nice little tangent about, are we really sitting in a democracy today? Is democracy what the people before us really defined it to be? Or has this what's in it for me society changed so dramatically from democracy that we are no longer in a democratic state? Something to think about on a Thursday afternoon after a full-on conference. So we are seeing this play out in a number of different things, but I'm first going to talk about social triangle theory. Hands up if you've heard of social triangle theory. 1, good. 2, good. So social triangle theory is my theory that I have formulated over the last 6 months, and it is that every single society, whether it be first world, second world, or tribal, or third world, has 3 key elements. So I'm going to get you to get out a piece of paper. It is an engagement conference after all, we will be a little bit interactive. So on that piece of paper, I want you to draw a triangle. And for those of you who work with engineers, please make it an equilateral triangle. That means every side is the same. So once you've drawn that triangle, it's amazing how quickly comms and engagement people can get distracted, isn't it? I do it myself. I'm going to draw a triangle. Are you drawing a triangle? What sort of triangle are we drawing? So you've all got a triangle, yeah? Okay, on that triangle, I want you to put the letter P on one of the points of the triangle. I want you to put the letter R on another point, and the letter C on the third point. So again, this applies to every single society, first world, second world, third world, tribal. The P stands for political leaders, or the leaders of that society. The R stands for religious institutions, or spiritual practices of that society. And the C stands for community. And I define community here in terms of person and place. So people, my friends, my family, my neighbours, and place in terms of my country, my city, my suburb, my land. So get those pens, or finger if you're doing it on the screen, and put a big cross through the P. Every single country, every single region, every single community, and I defy you to name one that doesn't fit this, we are cynical and over and do not trust our political leaders. Now there is a whole other conference on that, the reasons as to why we don't trust them and how that plays out. But for the purposes of today, that trust is not there. That impacts us, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So I'm going to get you to put a big cross through the letter R. There is rapidly declining trust in the religious institutions of our societies. Again, there are many valid reasons why, and we won't go into all of them, but it is there. What is really interesting, I found it interesting, in the data is people who identify as being religious, and religious is defined, excuse me, in the data as somebody who attends a church or place of spiritual practice more than twice or more a week. Sorry, a month. A week, that'd be amazing. Twice or more a month. So every fortnight you might go to church, you might go to the Buddhist centre, you might go to the Jewish synagogue, you might go to the mosque, whatever it is. So those people have identified as having that practice. So interestingly, people who identify as being religious are not walking away from religion. They're just walking away from the religious institutions, which I found fascinating. Again, a whole range of valid reasons why, but fascinating nonetheless that they're holding on to their religion and their belief, but not the relationship with their church or synagogue or mosque or whatever, wherever they have that connection. I'm now going to get you to get your pen and circle the letter C. So all we have left in what made up a society 5, 10, 15 years ago is community. So all we have left is people and place. So anytime you put a road, a rail, some kind of massive building, some other kind of linear infrastructure project, pipeline, what have you, through their place, you are impacting that community. Anytime you're doing it to those people, to their friends, to their family, to their neighbours, you are impacting that community. Now that's our reality. Many of us work on big infrastructure projects, usually for government, state, local, and they do have big impacts. And I'm not here to teach you how to sell the shit sandwich, because a shit sandwich is a shit sandwich, right? But I'm here to help you, hopefully through this, share my thoughts on this as to why people feel the way they do and why they have the outrage, so that we can better deal with it as an industry. So I come back to this outrage that we're seeing is because lifestyle and property and people, things that mean things to people, are being impacted. So if my only asset is in my home, if I'm lucky enough to own my own home, so one, if I'm lucky enough to own my own home, and two, my only asset or my greatest asset is in my home, then if you do something that threatens my home, I'm not going to be happy about it. And your road may be 2 or 3 streets away from my home, but that's going to impact my property value. That's going to impact my lifestyle. Your desalination project might be in the next suburb, but the trucks are going to go through my street to get there. That impacts my way of life. I can see some people nodding furiously. Good, I'm glad we're in alignment. I'm now going to go through what I see are the 5 key trends or key things that have come out of this that impact us as an industry. And then I'll finish up, don't worry, it'll go for a while, but I'll finish up by talking about resilience and how we can work with that as an industry. So the first one that I see, community is now the biggest project risk. I'm sorry to anyone who is an engineer in the room, but frankly, engineering, you throw enough money at it and enough smart people at it and you will resolve the issue. That's the beauty of engineering. 1 + 1 = 3 or 5 or 2 or 7, whatever it may be at the time, whatever the perfect solution is, there will be one. Or an almost perfect one, at least. But in what we do, because it is intangible, and because it deals with feelings and emotions and outrage, it doesn't matter how much money you throw at it, it doesn't matter how many amazing experts you throw at it, you cannot necessarily guarantee the outcome. Now you can, with enough good people and resources, you can modify it, you can mitigate, you can anticipate, but you can't guarantee. Hands up if you've had a client who have asked, or a boss who said to you, or a minister who said to you, I want you to guarantee that consultation will mean the community will not be outraged. Hands up if you've had that experience. A few of you. So what do you say? So there's a no over here. Over here, what do you say? Dreaming. You're dreaming. Using the good Australian line from that wonderful movie. You're dreaming. Because we just can't guarantee that. You can't make tangible the intangible. We'd love to, but that's another discussion for another day. So I pull up this slide and I borrow, and apologies, you can't really see the article. As long as you can see it's from the Australian Financial Review. That is the main thing I'm trying to get across here. So serious, credible, conservative newspaper, right? This is the stuff our government ministers, their staff, the CEOs, the secretaries, the deputy secretaries, this is the stuff they read. They also read the trash ones because they need to see what's going on at that level as well. But this is where business leaders look for news. And what I love about it is there is a figure in there, and feel free to use this stat. $20 billion of road infrastructure projects, only road, in Australia in the last decade, so only road and only Australia, have been put on hold or delayed. So it's cost the government that much money because of community outrage. So next time somebody throws at you, well, what's the value of engagement? How can you prove the value of engagement? Throw $20 billion at them. It's okay, we can't do a formula for everything we do, and we can't say we inject these processes here and a bit of intuition and a bit of experience and you'll get this outcome. But we can tell this stat, and it came out of the Next Gen research which was done with the University of Melbourne. So you don't get more credible than that. This stat I throw around all the time. This is the stat that makes ministers go, oh, can I see that engagement plan again? It makes ministers' staff go, okay, we'll take your advice. Or we'll at least consider it. The other trend I wanted to talk about was meaning. I've lost my notes. So, meaning is a critical motivator. In this busy day and age, we've got so much on. We've got most of us full-time work or at least really busy part-time work. Many of us have kids, some of us have caring responsibilities for parents or aunts or uncles or grandparents. You may also be involved in community activities. You're all clearly involved in some kind of volunteer effort for IAP2. You may be into sporting stuff. You may have a second job. We have busy, busy lives. All of us have busy, busy lives. You may also be studying. I can't imagine what life would be like to do all of those things at once, but I'm sure there's at least one person in this room who's doing that. And I'm looking at her right now. So we have very busy lives, as do our communities, the communities that we impact. They will only come and talk to us if it means something to them. This is supposed to be my heart. I know it's on the other side, but the microphone is there. So if you think about, what I'm going to ask you to do, question before that. Hands up if you have protested anything. And when I say protested, it could be on a protest where you're walking down the street. It could be some kind of electronic protest. It could be you've signed a petition, you've written a letter to someone, you've made a complaint. Hands up if you've done one of those things. So every single person in this room is a community activist. Congratulations, my friends, and welcome. I learned a lot about community engagement from being an activist, because I learned to anticipate crowd behaviour, because I used to instigate it, sometimes still do. I learned to understand what the outcomes of certain decisions or actions might be, because again, I used to instigate it, sometimes still do. How am I going for time? Okay, so just an aside, I want to share with you the last protest that I did because I think it's just so funny. We were protesting, I live in the inner west of Sydney, and we were protesting development, or overdevelopment as we called it, in the Marrickville area, which is in the inner west of Sydney. We didn't have a problem with infill development, absolutely agree it needs to happen. I'll backtrack a little bit. The inner west of Sydney, for those of you who are not familiar with it, is mostly professional, mostly educated, mostly champagne drinking socialists. Yeah? You can picture, I can say that because I don't drink champagne, but I fit that. I'm a fancy craft beer drinking socialist. Or my daughter would say slightly left of centre, but we're just slightly different in our politics. So we thought we're going to protest because we don't want overdevelopment. A little bit is fine. So we don't want 32-storey apartment blocks, but maybe 8 to 10. We could handle that. That would fit with the area still. Wouldn't be the highest buildings. That's okay. So we decided to protest this decision. So we met in the local park. There were a few speakers, the old school style. It was quite fun. And then we decided to march. Now, what I loved about this protest is we thought, we don't actually want to march down the road, because that's a little bit too intrusive for the cars. So we thought we'd march on the footpath. We're very polite. Not only did we march on the footpath, we made sure there was enough room for pedestrians to get past us. And wait for it, we stopped for the little green man. There were a few like that, I'm sure. That's right. But we achieved the outcome we were trying to achieve. So I'm not suggesting you have to be polite protesters. I'm just sharing how, as my daughter says, I've gone from being a ratty leftist socialist to someone who is considerably less so. But I still protest every now and then. So, I digress. Where are we up to? Meaning. So we protest things that are meaningful to us. We do something about things that are meaningful to us. Because if we don't care about something, we're not going to do anything about it. Why would we? We're way too busy. We've got way too much shit on. We don't see all the friends we want to see. We don't spend enough time with our family. We don't have enough downtime. We don't do enough exercise. I'm seeing a few people nod here. I'm telling my story, but it looks like it's a story for a few of you. So things that come through our letterbox or come through our phone or come to our attention, if it doesn't mean anything, it doesn't matter. So what this means for us as an industry is we used to, for those of you who have been around for a while, like me, we used to meet a whole smorgasbord of community members when we went out to talk about different projects. Now we only meet the really angry ones, or the really upset ones. So that requires a whole level of resilience in our industry that we've had to develop. And my friends, I don't actually think we're there. I see burnout, particularly from emerging professionals, because they don't have the skills, experience and resilience yet. And I talk a lot with people, just in one-on-one conversations, around, I have a saying, Teflon and poker face. And what I mean by that is, does everyone know what Teflon is? It's that non-stick stuff they put in cooking, yeah. So you can still do what you need to do. You can still be professional. You can still cook if you're using it on a cooking implement. But if it gets through the cooking implement, it damages that fry pan. If it gets through to you, you can't do your job properly. You're no longer objective and professional. So don't get me wrong, you need to have a level of empathy to do your job. Because if you don't, go do PR. You need to get people, you need to have that empathy. You need to be able to put yourself in their shoes. Because if you don't, you cannot do what you need to do for them. You cannot go above and beyond to help them as much as you can. And many of us have different ways of saying that, but that's where we all are. Excuse me. Finding that balance is really hard. And I often talk to people about trigger points. So what I mean by that is, work out for you what's going to get through that Teflon. Because you all have your own kryptonite, okay? Kryptonite, you all know what kryptonite was. Yeah, good. I mentioned it to a young group of people a couple of months ago, and they're like, what's kryptonite? Superman. So, my kryptonite, I can't tell Nana that the house she has lived in, the house she was born in, the house she grew up in, the house she had children in, the house she had grandchildren in, and the house she plans to die in. I cannot tell Nana that that house needs to be acquired for a really important road project or rail project. But for the greater good, Nana, please give up your house. I can't do that. That's my kryptonite. That gets through. So I've learned that that's one of my triggers. And because it is one of my triggers, I say to my staff, you need to do this one. So we need to find those points where we can be resilient and understand what gets through. Because it's really important to maintain that tricky balance, and don't get me wrong, it's a tough balance, between being empathetic and balancing that with the ability to remain objective and professional enough to do our job. Because if it gets through, you'll be thinking about it that night. You'll be awake that night. And I'm not talking about the awake you have when you think, oh, did I do everything I could do for that person? I'm talking about the awake that night where you're crying and upset because Nana has to move. It's almost like you're Nana's granddaughter. You can't get to that point. If you do, you need a holiday, perhaps some counselling, and at the very least a conversation with a mate who gets engagement. And I know that the Australian culture very much says, counselling, we don't need that. But the reality is, more and more, people need to debrief on things. And I'm not saying, I've got to find a diplomatic way of saying this. Forgive me. That's my disclaimer ahead of time. I'm not saying that you're batshit crazy because you need to use a counsellor. I'm saying that you might just need a little bit of help to get through that hump, and that is okay. That is being human, and that is getting you back onto that professional path. Anyway, I digress. So, meaning, we've talked about. Community equals people and place. So because it means so much to people, if you interrupt that, that's going to be a problem. This image here is my youngest nephew, who was 2 years old at the time. He said to his dad, make me a house out of the cardboard box that the washing machine or whatever was delivered in. Now, how the hell did he know about the concept of a house? And how did this little guy, who is now only 4, how did he get sold the 1950s house dream? It still pervades our society. Now, there are many, many, many reasons, economic and otherwise, why people in Sydney, parts of Melbourne and other parts of Australia, and indeed New Zealand and other parts of the world, where young people cannot afford to buy property anymore. They've been priced out of the market. And this is not an economic discussion. But it's just we need to understand that that's the backdrop that we're working with. So people either still believe this, or they're lucky enough to have their own little place in the world that they've purchased, or at least the bank owns, and they borrow it from the bank every day. And if we're going to interrupt that, challenge that, threaten that, they're not going to go, okay. They're not going to go, hey, no worries, take my house. I've only made it look absolutely amazing, spent the last 5 weekends repainting it because I couldn't afford to get the guys out. Planted that tree myself, my dog's remains out the backyard. Sure, take my house. Means nothing to me. We all know that's not the case. Social media. Social media, and I'm sure many of you in here are aware of this, it's a game changer. And this is because for those of you who started when I did in this game, I started when there was no internet, believe it or not. I'm showing my age now. But it actually wasn't that long ago, can I reassure you? I'm not 100. So there was no internet. Most information with journalists got shared by a fax. Hands up if you know what a fax is. Good? Okay. Now, communities can not only find out what each other are doing, but they can connect. They can share tools, techniques, lessons learned. Communities are really, really clever. Never, ever underestimate a community. They know their shit. And when they don't, they know who they can contact, or at least a way to find out who they can contact. One of the really interesting, and I'm not here to talk about WestConnex in detail, but one of the really interesting things about WestConnex, a major project in Sydney, is that the communication and engagement team came across a community that was connected, well connected, actively connected, with communities in 5 or 6 different parts of the world who were each experiencing their own big intrusive road project. And they openly shared, hey, we tried this, give it a go. We did this with the minister, it worked. So we found we not only had to be dealing with the issues that were coming out at the time, we had to be actively Googling and following every other project in this space around the world, resource intensive, to anticipate what our communities might do next. It's fascinating, but you don't get a lot of sleep. Projects are political. Every project is political. In this photo, every single person there is either a politician or ran for the local election, or state election, or federal election. And the reason why I say projects are political is because our politicians and would-be politicians are always, and this is not a judgment call, it's just understanding, they are always looking for a platform. What can get me elected? What does the community care about that I can tap into that gets me into that politician's seat? Again, not a judgment, just the reality. So WestConnex was great for politicians in the Sydney area, because most people in the inner west have a view about WestConnex, and it's not necessarily positive. It's the project people like to hate right now. There's always one, especially in Sydney, we're a funny lot. I heard a few people say, So what was really interesting is WestConnex was to blame for, apparently, the amalgamation of councils across New South Wales. WestConnex was blamed for the privatisation of buses in the inner west of Sydney. WestConnex was blamed for work along the Parramatta side of Western Sydney that was nowhere near or not connected to anything that WestConnex was doing. WestConnex was blamed for the too many kids in classes. So the class size is 28 and they were concerned that it was getting close to 30, 31, 32, and WestConnex was to blame for that. And the last one, WestConnex was to blame for the fact that the hospital in Newtown didn't get enough funding. I don't know what enough looked like, but it wasn't enough, and that was the fault of WestConnex. They were the 5 key issues. I've combined them together. The 5 key issues that these politicians ran on in the various local, state and federal elections. So given that context, it makes it really hard for us to manage the projects. I'm working on a schools project right now. You'd think school projects would be good news. The government is building new schools, new high school, new primary school, on the same site as a TAFE. They're not going to be connected, but they'll all be next to each other, so you can have connections if you want, but no safety issues. It's going to be amazing, future-focused learning and everything the educational people talk about. But there's a problem, because the local politician has decided, the local opposition politician has decided that he wants to get the seat this year. So he is telling the community that the high school, primary school and TAFE are being shut down, closed. So the complete and utter opposite. So instead of spending our time dealing with impacted communities, doing engagement with the students, working with the teachers to work on how the design would best work for see if I can say this word, for pedagogy, which basically means how you teach, the practice of teaching. So instead of doing that, we're doing part of that, but we're being distracted by trying to talk with communities and explaining to the communities around the area that the schools are indeed not closing. And I'm sure many of you have those kind of distractions on your projects as well. And the last key point, Protesters are anyone and anywhere. When I asked you earlier who had been in a protest or protested something, you all put your hands up. The photo I have here, who's heard of the knitting nanas? Hannah? Many of you. So for those of you who haven't heard of the knitting nanas, these women are traditionally farmers' wives, the backbone of their local communities, not usually involved in protest in any way, quite respectful and conservative. These women protested the coal seam gas movement because they were scared of the impact on their land. So the land, part of community, and the meaning. So it meant something to them and it was impacting their land. What was different about these protests and what was actually really beautiful about these protests is these women would come, sit down on their fold-up chairs, they would bring their tea, their scones and their knitting. And they knitted themselves a chain rope that they wrapped around themselves and around the fence to the particular farms. And the construction workers did not know how to handle it. What do? How can you deal with that when you're faced with Nana who calls you dear and offers you scones? Typical protesters don't exist anymore. Typical protesters used to be, well, you tell me. What was a typical protester 10, 15 years ago? Shout out. Yep.
Students.
Yep.
Unions.
Yep. Students, unions, sometimes unemployed, dreadlocks, hairy legs, tree huggers, incredibly idealistic. That was me. Not 15 years ago, a few more than that, but that's okay. But now protesters are anyone. They're us. They're our families. They're our grandmothers. So that also changes the way we engage. Where we once used to go, oh, they're just the greenie tree huggers, they'll always have a view, we can't change it. We can't do that. We need to actually seriously think about where they're at and why they're at where they're at. And if we can provide information to them, then we should. Not write them off. If we can discuss their concerns and issues with them, then we should. Again, and I'm sure many of the around the room know this, you're not going to win everyone over. But if you can involve them in the process, give them the information, and be as available as possible to answer their questions, address their concerns, then you'll win over at least the people who respect the process. You'll get a lot of people saying, well, I don't agree, but I can see how you've done it, and you've been very thorough. I take that as a huge compliment. I can see a few people nodding around the room. So that's kind of my thinking on outrage and where it's at and how it impacts us. Just wondered if you had any questions or observations before I hand over to my mate Chris. And I've run out of time, so you can't have questions.
We are using the Slido, so if you want to put your questions on Slido, maybe it just depends on really how long Chris takes us to. Thank you, Kylie. Thank you.
Bless you. Jingariri. Kia ora koutou katoa. Ngā mihi nui ki a koutou, tālo whalava, ni Sambula Manaka. There may be other cultures in the room, and I just want to acknowledge you all for being interested in this session. And late arrivals, there's a spare seat right up the very front if you want it. What I was intending to do was sing a waiata, but I'm going to try and just compress what it is I'm going to be presenting today. So I might just sing you the first verse and I'll explain why I'm doing so. Mano te whānau te muka tangata e kore rawane e motu e. Tātai ahorau, he whiri nui e, he whiri roroa e. Tātai e ngā rau kia maro mai te taura tāngata What I've been singing about is a song or a waiata that was created by a whānau, a community of practice that I'm a part of. They're all educators. Most of them were born and raised in New Zealand, and the majority are fluent in 2 languages, English and Māori. All of us are on a bicultural journey, and that includes myself. So I consider myself a child of the South Pacific, and what Margie shared with you were some of the insights of my ethnic heritage. My dad, who came to New Zealand from Samoa in 1966. We think he was 17, but suspect that he might have had some irregularities with his arrival documentation. He was keen to get to the land of milk and honey, and that's how New Zealand was described in the Pacific at the time. There are quite possibly some other rugby players that have arrived since then as well. My mother is 5th generation Irish stock. Her maiden name is Flynn. And when there's an Irish, All Blacks or Samoan rugby game on, everything just seems to lift, including my adrenaline levels. A waiata is a way of opening or greeting people in a cultural context. And I realise that we're on the land of a nation of an indigenous people who greeted us a couple of days ago, and I found that fascinating, being out on the front lawn. I've never been involved in a welcome to country like that, and I was just quite captivated, and I think many of you may have been as well. What I want to share with you today are some insights into the journey I've had, particularly in the last 8 years, but just over 20 years as what I now understand is an engagement practitioner. It wasn't called that back in the mid-90s when I started my professional career in the police. So I'm going to share with you a handful of stories. There'll be some insights that you take from them. Each of you will take something different. And I just hope that I'm able to provide enough insights and stimulus into trust in different cultural communities. And when I say communities or cultures, the way I understand culture, it's the way things are done here. That's my common English sort of framing. You know, how do you guys roll? You know, there's a lingo that my daughters use, and I find that I'm forever translating between different groups. If you were reading some of the waiata, it talked about weaving, and tātai ahorau is a grouping of words which essentially means to weave together our collective knowledge and wisdom. And the visual that you see up here is a product of weaving. You can weave rope, you can weave together plaits or braids or bags, kete, and you can incorporate other elements. And in this one, we've got, what do you call that, Nossie? It's a pearl shell or an oyster shell. So it's taking natural elements and it's creating functional things. Mother of pearl shell, that sounds good. So trust in cultures, I thought I would consult the authority, Google what comes up. Some simple definitions. Firm belief in the reliability, truth or ability of something or someone, cultures, the ideas, customs and social behaviours of a particular people or society. Just outside the door, and some of you might have contributed to the light bulb wall, I've been scanning it for the last 2 days, just waiting to see what emerges on it. And there are some that come out which I think relate to the purpose of this talk, which is to prompt people's thinking, potentially a call to action around cultural competency. This one down here, case studies with practical implementation, information, not just generics or results, increasing visibility and inclusion of cultural diversity, addressing white privilege and racism, measurement, communities of practice, case study libraries. I really like where people's heads are at, those who have contributed so far, and if you haven't yet, please feel free to grab a light bulb and I'll stick it up. With the Slido over the next roughly 20-25 minutes, there's a chance for you to answer 2 questions on Slido. The first one is asking about to what extent you see cross-cultural competence being a part of your work in the coming years. The second question is an opportunity for us to understand who are the cultures, what are the cultural places where potentially IAP2 could put some resources into building that knowledge base, building that case study library. So if you get a moment, if you sort of find you're wandering away from what I'm talking about, jump into Slido. There is a framework that I came across recently. Peter Senge is an author, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, smart guy. I've been reading his works for 10 years or so now. And he put out a paper recently, so in the last 3 or 4 months, and there's a model in it. When I saw it, I felt 20 years of engagement practice solidified into a model in front of me. It is Creative Commons, so I'm able to share it with you, but I just wanted to make sure of that. And it's all about systems change, the conditions that are holding a problem in place. And there's a wee proverb: a fish is swimming along one day when another fish comes up and says, "Hey, here's the water." The first fish stares back blankly at the second fish and says, "What's water?" Do we realise that we've been conditioned, that our beliefs, that sometimes our values are being shaped by the environment in which we have grown up? We have been acculturated to. And how often do we stop and think, what's the water in which I'm living, in which I'm practicing my engagement? I'm just going to grab my triangle that I made, and I'm keen to know if anyone else folded their paper across diagonally to get the perfect equilateral triangle. So Kylie's, I've put my P and my R and my C on one side, and then I flipped it over and I thought, as a wee thought experiment, what if I overlay that inverted triangle? And what this talks about are conditions of systems change, and these have been drawn from that field and from a number of other bodies of research, and the reference is down the bottom. On the first level, it identifies explicit areas where you can have transactional structural change. And if you think about this through an engagement lens, there are policies, strategies, frameworks. There is the practice itself, which is nestled in the middle. And then you've got the resourcing. And I really like what Kylie said about the state of our people, her reference to just how our people are looking after themselves and their colleagues. Because I'm seeing chronic pressure being put on my colleagues, whether they've been in my teams, and I'll talk a little bit about my background as we go through. the empathy that you need to have to be an effective engagement practitioner, particularly in the face-to-face world, that can make you vulnerable. And I've seen too many good people fall over because they have gone too hard for too long, they've gone too wide, they've exposed themselves, and they drop away. That's fine, we've got that explicit level, then there's a layer underneath it. And it identifies some of the semi-explicit areas. The first one are relationships and connections. Do you have them in the space where you are trying to facilitate your project? And then next to that is power dynamics. So what is the power game in this place? And I'm not trying to demean the world by using the word game, but I have a sense of play. Actually, that helps me get through some pretty tough engagements. It's one thing to have the top layer, but if you don't have the bottom in place, if you do not have the connections or the relationships or understand the power dynamics in your environment, then the top layer it's feeble, it's flimsy. At the base, which I absolutely get, and I found from the keynote, the first keynote speaker talking about the last 200 years of this place. And in New Zealand, we've got a similar story. It's not the same. We've got some incredible advantages, but we've got a 200-year history that has some very similar components to it. And if you don't understand the history of New Zealand and the Māori land wars and confiscation of the vast majority of the nation, it's an interesting read. So the mental models that lock this all in place, that's where the transformation happens. It is asking those questions like, what is the water that we're living in? What are the beliefs that I've been conditioned to have about that group of people living on that land? Or that group who are claiming some sovereignty or ownership over that waterway. There's a brief description here, and it's a fabulous read, this paper. I hope I've just given you a bit of a sense of the structure. What I do like are some of the quotes that have come from the researchers, those involved. I'll just leave them there for about 30 seconds to give you a chance. So over the next wee while, I'm going to tell you some stories. It's spinning yarn, and I'm going to reflect back on this inverted triangle. The first one is about values, and most of you will be aware of these, especially those of you who were dancing last night. There were a few after the core value awards. You'll be familiar with these. These are the international IAP2 core values. And when I facilitate the basic certificate, the core papers of essentials design, I weave in the bicultural narrative that's locked in that bottom, that mental model, into the courses. So there's the course content, and I find that I have to contextualise it to a bicultural nation. I cannot just deliver it as a set of tools. They need to be applicable. And what you see here from the Treaty of Waitangi, which was signed by a good number of Māori chiefs and the representatives of the Crown of Great Britain in 1840, these are the guiding principles of that treaty. These are the expectations that reach back nearly 200 years, and to be blunt, New Zealand as a nation have been very patchy with how these values have been applied. And the dialogue that we tend to have in the space is, to what extent are the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi connected and aligned with the core values of IAP2? And where we tend to get to is, they're pretty close. And I've included this slide on equity, equality and no barriers because depending on where you're working, is it an equity approach that you're taking or is it equality? Are you trying to give everyone the same thing or are you trying to get everyone to the same level or place? And these characters watching a game of cricket, it's a nice mental way to see that. And if you are sight impaired, which is hard to determine from here, you've got the first one under equality, everyone's standing on a box, but the wee fella can't see over the fence. The one in the middle is where the wee fella gets 2 boxes, mid-sized man gets 1, and the tall guy, he doesn't need 1. Equality, equity, and no barriers is that ideal situation where the barriers are not there, and that's an ideal. I'm just flicking this up for you to either recognise, because you've seen it before, or draw it to your attention. This is the Quality Assurance Standard of IAP2, and on page 25 is a framework for quality engagement. This is something that I have blown up on an A1 poster, and I take it wherever I'm consulting. I'll roll it out, help people understand. It is a framework for quality engagement. It's not perfect, and it probably needs a revision, but through a cultural lens, this applies, because what's up on the left spine here, these are the core values. What I just showed you about the Treaty of Waitangi, that's how I position this. It's almost like they're bookended. Core values, treaty principles, quality engagement. Second story is about my hometown. This was a game-changing day for our city. 186 people died directly after that, a whole lot more soon after that. Physical damage, 100,000 buildings significantly damaged, 10,000 demolished. It's a story that's known, and this was 8 years ago, and it doesn't seem that long. People who live by rivers. People live by rivers for certain reasons. They love the outlook. They love the fact that there are ducks or birds. They love to be able to go across and throw a picnic blanket. There are values there for people of a place next to a river. Earthquakes change the way rivers behave. Planning people, once you understand the geology of the place and how that's shifted, that means big decisions in terms of rezoning or repurposing land. People who live with fires. We don't have many in Christchurch. This one surprised us 2 years ago. But we have drawn a lot on the experiences, especially the psychosocial experiences from people in Victoria. Dr. Rob Gordon, does anyone recognise that man's name? Some of you. So a psychologist he came across and has been a great support. And I remember an interesting conversation with Dr. Gordon about what his clinical view of psychosocial looked like in a world where some people have a much more holistic framework of health and wellness, like many of our Pacific Māori people, and I would hazard a guess, many Indigenous communities. But we're coming back. This was an empty lot. You couldn't see any buildings from this perspective 4 years ago. So things are coming back in a way. They're in progress. And this is an area of land which is very special to mana whenua, the people of the land. My last job that I finished 2 months ago, I was a general manager of Regenerate Christchurch, a statutory planning agency that was established with a board, with central, what you'd call federal government as a shareholder and local government as a shareholder. And we had 6 statutory partners, and one of those partners was Te Runanga o Ngāi Tapu, one of the biggest iwi in New Zealand, and the iwi, or tribe, that has the greatest coverage of the South Island. Basically 95% of the South Island. They are $1 billion corporate entity now, thanks to treaty settlement just over 20 years ago. They are legal, they are wised up, they know how to play this engagement game at a governance level. They are partners. So one of the takeaways is that in some fortunate places, you can have a serious governance, co-governance level operating framework. Call it an alliance, call it a partnership, that's what it is, it's co-governance. So that is your high level framework. And this land here, nearly $2 billion was invested in purchasing 5,500 homes. Many of those people did not want to move. And there is still a story to go there and a 30-year plan which is emerging, which is likely to be signed off by a minister by the close of this year. It's been a 2 and a bit year process, and I've been a part of that. Many of you will be familiar with this. When I talk about co-governance, shared leadership and action, the green profile in the middle, that is where Crown Treaty, that is in the middle. Shared leadership and action. This is a visual. If you think about stakeholders and how you communicate, or who are your stakeholders, I'm not expecting you to identify these brands, but I want you to see the way that they've been structured. Our organisation is at the base here, and there are 5, 6, 7 statutory organisations that are at the bottom because they're doing the heavy lifting. Ngāi Tahu are in there as well. And at the centre of this model, you've got people and communities. They should be and have been, and hopefully they'll remain at the centre of our thinking. And there is amazing diversity in there. And that has implications for all of the engagement work that we do. From a policy perspective, as an organisation, we thought it was going to be critical that we have a set of guiding engagement principles. And in that, we co-designed those with over 100 of our key stakeholders. We got them together. Before we even start this, before we activate, we want to determine what needs to be the guiding principles for our engagement. We had our culturally and linguistically diverse communities. We had young people from secondary, tertiary education. We had our Māori, tangata whenua. We had Pacific people. We had cognitive diversity throughout the room, which made that set of guiding principles a compelling proposition, not only for our board, but central government, shareholder and local government. So we got the mandate, the formal mandate, to drive our engagement off these principles. Sorry, this is a little bit busy, but it reflects a couple of things. One is the sequencing and our approach from left to right for our engagement for this 2 and a bit years. We started this braid going back to the weaving. We wanted to have imagery that depicted the co-design right from the get-go, all the way to that black dot on the right-hand side of the screen, which is the ministerial endorsement of the plan for that land, which is over 600 hectares. 30-year plan. It's reasonably sizable. And throughout this journey, we have had advisory groups. So not only partnership, but we have had technical and community input for our engagement processes and the content. It has been really resource intensive, and if things come to pass that this is challenged in a high court or a judicial review, I think you have a slightly different name in Australia, we'd like to think we've got integrity all through this. Shaky, can I do a time check? I've just...
Yeah, you've got another 20 minutes.
Okay.
I mean, that will be time for questions.
Canterbury Health System. Okay, I'll just pick up the pace a little bit. This is a model which 10 years ago, the health system of Canterbury started on a journey of transformation, and it was built on a platform, a burning platform, of needing an entire tertiary hospital replicated within 5 years if we change the direction of travel. So if you're involved in health, this is a story that you probably want to find a bit more about. At the centre of this model, as opposed to one that was shown in here yesterday afternoon, you've got people who are well in their own homes and communities at the centre of the model. It's a different paradigm. This vision was co-designed by nearly 2,500 community, clinical and managerial leaders and members. And it was on this mandate, not a formal mandate, but a social mandate that was built in the health community, that we've been able to get onto a pretty remarkable journey. So I just wanted to put that in front of you because, as I flick over that one, health and all policies, approach, social determinants of health, these are all inputs into this process. You'll understand that one. I'll pause on this. It looks a bit like a basketball or a dartboard. Actually, the dartboard's not too bad an analogy here. But this is, so you've got your hierarchies, bureaucracies. If you can complement those with a networked approach that draws the best from the people in the hierarchies, but it's flat, you can do some remarkable things. This is under the bonnet. This is the network. It is an alliance approach that health have adopted from construction, and this is what's driving the Canterbury Health System. And key to it is the partnership with Ngāi Tahu, Mana Whenua ki Waitaha, the culturally and linguistically diverse communities, the Pacific peoples, and a huge clinical diversity. There's a big story in behind this, but just maybe a highlight. Recent opening earlier this month of a new clinical building. This is the blessing. It took an hour and a half. We were singing for most of it as we prepared to enter the new outpatients building, as we went up to the 4th floor and worked our way down, because this is not just a clinical facility. This is a place of haora, of holistic health and wellness. And that's a significant shift from a clinical mindset to one that embraces biculturalism. This is a one-pager which reflects what education learned off the back of health. And we've got a transformation that's taking place in New Zealand, and it's making the most of the crisis that was the earthquakes. And in simple talk, they also have taken on an alliance approach. Here's a slightly different one. Has anyone been over to the west coast of New Zealand? This is the Paparoa National Park. It is one of the most beautiful, timeless places I think you could go. You could rummage around up there and think there were dinosaurs that were about to crash through the trees. It's got that sort of feel. And the mana whenua of this place is a small runanga, which is a part of Ngāi Tahu. They're called Ngāti Waiwai, and they've got their own very special history, and there's some brutality in that history, like many of the tribes had. The reason I'm showing you that is because that escarpment, are there any geologists in the room? Who knows what tends to live under escarpments that look like that? Coal. And I know you mine a range of different natural resources in this country, but that's the entrance to the Pike River mine. And if you followed our history, the little township of Greymouth, there are still 29 men who are inside that mine. They've been there for 7 years. there was a tremendous explosion, and they are together. That's one short of two rugby teams, or two rugby teams with one who's been sent off with a red card. Their name tags are still on the board. Their families are waiting for them to come home. And we've got a very interesting, very emotional group of family members, some who want their men out, others who think they should stay, some who don't want to see them separated. And there is a big conversation in New Zealand about re-entry. Whether it's safe and viable enough, that's one thing, but separating those men, because some of them won't be able to come home, some probably could. When it comes to Ngāti Waewae and the mana whenua approach, they have chosen to form a view that they would support what it is the families want. The conversations that we've had in there, and my role as the independent facilitator, to work with the iwi, with the Department of Conservation and with the family members, has been incredibly respectful. It's been a beautiful and haunting conversation. There is a concept, and I want to share this with you as practitioners, compassionate disconnection. That's where you protect yourself by not getting too emotionally involved so that you can manage the process. And when I was in rooms like this, with iwi, with family members, with DOC people, Department of Conservation, the very first opening round of introductions, righto, name, and where are you from? Project manager wanted it for 15 minutes. Look, I'm going to need a bit longer than that, 20 at the most. Seriously, we need to give space for this. I don't know how long this is going to take. It took an hour and a half. And everyone was in tears, myself included. So as an independent facilitator, I completely failed with compassionate disconnection. My heart just went open and out, and it has been the most beautiful engagement process. Here's a different story about a place in the South Pacific. Michelle, Martin, and I have been working as there are 5 engagement practitioners on behalf of IAP2. We've been working with the United Nations SCAP, which is the Economic and Social Commission for Asia and Pacific. This was a view out of my plane window in January. I'd attempted to get to Kiribati on December, the week before Christmas, but they only fly in and out of Kiribati on a Monday and a Thursday. And my plane was delayed. So second attempt, made it to Kiribati, and most of the nation looks like that. They are a group of atolls. They are coral atolls. The highest point in their nation is 3 metres. It's about the height of that midpoint in the door. And the narrative that you're hearing, the cultural narrative, is climate change, increased sea level rise, saltwater intrusion into the last of their natural freshwater. They've got some challenges. But boy, the respect being there, the humbleness of those people is stunning. There's a lot of international aid that's coming in, building causeways like this between the atolls. Lots of investment. China, Japan, Taiwan, Korea. And this is me driving to the venue where we're going to have the first facilitated dialogue. That goes for a couple of kilometres. So what was at the end of that day was with a group of local people, including 6 recently graduated young people in their early 20s. They had been in Brisbane, Sydney, Lincoln University in Christchurch and Auckland. And they were all back, and they were all motivated to make an impact, a difference for their people back home. And when we talked about engagement, and I'll show you what was on the whiteboard, I found that when we were talking about engagement and I was using these English terms and people were kind of working this out, I said, we need to stop this conversation and I want to know from you, what do you think engagement, participation looks like from your cultural context? And we ended up with a conversation about a doubled hold waka and the importance of the binding, not too tight, because then it would be too rigid going over the waves. Not too loose, otherwise things would move apart. So there was an appreciation when you are engaging, you need to be flexible, you need to have enough structure, but enough semi-structure for a dialogue. There are a couple of concepts which I want to share with you. I'll just sort of quickly touch on these. Upwall, you can read it there. It is essentially reciprocity as a principle when you apply it to learning, and it means that each of us is both a teacher and a learner. And it is the concept that underpins our New Zealand early childhood curriculum, and it is all about weaving. Gets me thinking about our secondary and tertiary education. Maybe there's a bit more that we could do there. And this would be a takeaway for me to you as practitioners. If you are facilitating, it is the concept of talanoa. It is a similar concept across the Pacific, and they are the elements that make for a rich dialogue. So dialogue is probably the English word I would use that's closest to it. And the concepts of love, warmth, humour and respect, if you can create those, if you are working with Pacific people, I'm not sure about some of the other cultures, but that would be a takeaway. When you are creating a space and you've got Pacific people wanting to come in, consider this concept of talanoa. And this is what it looks like. This was me in Fiji last month, working with an amazing group of people from across 12 Pacific nations, from the Marshall Islands, Vanuatu up in the northwest, down to Tuvalu, Samoa. And what I found a powerful takeaway from this particular talanoa was when we created the space for them to share about the values and the proverbs from their nations that talk to partnership, participation and engagement. And they found they were reaching back into their cultural history and they were saying, well, this is what it means to us. By the end of that day, we had on one page, a big page, we've got an amazing collection of cultural stories and narratives that we can now ground any engagement that we have going forward. And we now have relationships not between me and them, but between themselves. And one of the of community development where I was grounded in is if you go into a community, when you extract yourself or leave, you must leave that community better off than if you had never intervened at all. Because if you cause harm or you create a dependency, I would be questioning, why did you go there in the first place? I'm going to pause there just to give a few minutes for questions. I hope that the stories that I've shared had meaning for you and you were able to make some connections, and even if there's only one thing that you take away, that's a gift from me to you. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.